Welcome back to the Papers Podcast. It's all about the health professions education literature. And here we all are gathered. Once again, we scan the literature for you. We scan the universe. We find great papers. Well, some of us find great papers. Some of us don't. And then we debate them fiercely and invent new words and new theories, apparently, based on the last episode. So welcome back, Lara.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back, John.
Hey, Jason. How's your hockey team doing this year? Oh, yeah, you're not in the playoffs, so don't worry about that.
You know what? My hockey team's developing. It's renewal. Sometimes you just got to do renewal. That's just the way it is.
We're into round 2.
Yep. Yeah, it's because you're a bandwagon jumper. And Linda has a paper today. It's making us all hungry because it's about food. Something about MasterChef, something. Linda, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I hope I can make everybody salivate over this paper. Let me ask, first of all, how comfortable are you with giving dietary advice, either to a patient, to your kids or family members or friends? I'll go Lara, Jason, John.
Not in the least. I don't like cooking. I'm not good at it. I cook really well with a phone. That's my comment.
Isn't that kind of hard to chew? I mean, the plastic and everything.
Takeout works every time.
Okay, I would like to say, as an ER doc, I'm really, really good about talking about fiber and its effect on bowel movements. Okay. Other than that, I have absolutely no nutrition expertise whatsoever, other than I live with Dr. Ruth Fari, who has a master's in clinical nutrition and before medicine and endlessly corrects all my mistakes.
So your personal anecdotes are way too far there, buddy. You can just dial your fiber stories down by like half an inch. I love cooking. I love food. And you also know that I have a bunch of crazy recommendations. Remember when I was on a ketogenic diet and I was peeing on urine sticks and all that kind of stuff? So we can talk about...
John's all about
ketones. We could talk about macros. We could talk about micros. We could talk about supplements. We could go into my closet and see how much creatine I'm on.
Okay,
it's not working, but I have lots of opinions. I don't think any of them are correct. And I think Jason, your wife, would just like roll her eyes and
she does.
And ask my patients to run for the hills.
In fact, one of the lines in our kitchen is, "So what diet is John on this week?" That's actually an actual line in our household.
This recording's not going well. We've already talked about Jason's fiber comments and John peeing on sticks. I'm just saying that the direction of this is bad.
Let's bring it back to reality then. And although I will mention that John actually won a prize for Book of the Year when we had a clinician educator competition. And his book was a cookbook. We all laughed because John was just learning how to cook then. And he thought that was the best thing since sliced bread, so to speak. Anyway, back to this.
It's called grilled cheese.
Yes. Back to this. I'll tell you about the title in a second, but I'll tell you why I did not choose this paper. I didn't choose it because it's a scoping review, although it's a reasonable example of that. I didn't choose it because it's talking about innovation, even though it is innovation. I chose it because I think it's a great topic for a foodie like me and John and Lara and Jason. You just have to put up with this. And also because it's linked to a podcast. So I wanted to talk a little bit during the podcast about podcasting and papers in podcasting. So that's the first thing. The paper is entitled Culinary Medicine as Innovative Nutrition Education for Med Students, a Scoping Review. It's in Academic Medicine, February 2023. The lead author is C. Newman, and there's a student and a resident on this one. There is a related podcast as well, which I have linked in the abstract. So a little bit of background. Food preparation, nutrition, and diet are important elements of health, of illness, and of prevention. Yet in general, we don't educate future physicians about addressing food related diseases, whether it's discussing behavioral changes, giving more fiber, or another thing I thought you would do in emergency is talk about those people coming in heart failure who are pouring out the salt shaker. But they're even for emergency docs.
The ones I really like to see, I say, how about some dim sum? Just get them
right.
out there, get them back.
Right. So in comes, there have been courses on nutrition for med students or residents, and they've usually been pretty dry, not very salty. But culinary medicine is sort of the new kid on the block. It's a combination of culinary arts, evidence-based medical nutrition therapy that teaches nutrition principles relevant to patient care, basically in a teaching kitchen, in a collaborative, relatable style, and also gives the learner some knowledge about their own diets and dietary wellness. These programs are incredibly popular, as you can imagine, but there is no standard curriculum, and so the authors wanted to identify the core programmatic aspects with demonstrated success. So the aim of their study was to synthesize programmatic approaches in medical education and assess the outcomes of hands-on culinary medicine programs on students, this is medical students in the U.S., preparedness to provide patients with nutrition counseling. And I will say now that there is an associated podcast of this, which we'll talk about. So before we go into the methods, thoughts, Jason, John, Lara, about the idea whether this is a reasonable study or not?
I gotta say, I was struck by it. It's no question that nutrition is something that is poorly taught or not taught to the level that all of us probably should have had. There's no question at all. This one focuses pretty narrowly on sending med students to a kitchen in the U.S. That seems like very niche to me, and I was a bit curious about where they came from. There must obviously a story behind it. Does nobody else in the world send med students to kitchens? I don't know, because they didn't go there. They didn't do a scope on that. And the kitchen part, I'm curious about, whether that's better. So maybe there is a rationale for this paper.
John?
Well, first off, I salute the idea of thinking about nutrition. I don't think I got any training in that in my medical school, but I also want to make sure that we talk about sleep and exercise and blood pressure and lipids, and metabolic syndrome rather than nutrition, all as the big elements of wellness before we get into the pathology and pathophysiology of disease, which we seem to focus on in medicine. And I don't want to rain on the parade, but I do wonder, when we talk about nutrition, should we talk a little bit, or at least contextualize and ground our conversation around socioeconomic status, like food security? Like, just looking at medical students who can afford what can they afford is very different than what I'm putting in my fridge right now as someone with a full-time job. Or our patients, what does that look like? Or what does celiac and allergy, we'll talk about celiac in the gastroenterology block and allergy presumably there, but what about religious elements? And so it gets pretty tricky because food is culture and food is so important. And you want to have a bit of a nuanced culture around that. So yeah, I like the idea. I wonder if I was a curriculum planner and saying, oh my goodness, everything's crowded, would I have enough time to send people to a kitchen? I don't know. There's a bunch of schools we're going to hear about, and we're going to see what the value was for them.
So I completely disagree, because this is a life skill for the learners as much as it is a skill for them to have with their clinicians, or with their patients, I would have loved, I'm so incredibly jealous. Like, if these authors are listening and they'll invite me, I'll fly my hiney over to do this with them, because I need how to learn how to cut an onion. Like, somebody's got to teach me.
Oh my God, I will teach you how to use a knife. I will buy you a knife and teach you. It's a life skill.
Dude, seriously? I'll come.
Yes.
We'll do this, because this is a life skill, and this is helping learners not only to support their patients, but this is an educational intervention that will help them throughout their life. So you know what? I know that somebody's going to throw daggers at me, but let's give them time in the curriculum. It's worth it. It's supporting them as human beings. Let's just do that.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to just go back to what John said. One of the things that comes out a little bit in the paper, but a lot more in the podcast, is how this actually addresses culture. It addresses self-health of the learners and the teachers. So some of the things that you were concerned about, John, it actually addresses. Let's go on to the methods. Their research question was, and I quote, how are novel culinary medical programs for U.S. medical students being structured? How do they assess student knowledge and attitudes regarding nutrition counseling for patients? So they wanted to know a little bit about the curriculum, but they also wanted to know if the programs were being evaluated. They used a scoping review, which I think is reasonable given this broad question and the relatively new area. And I pulled out my little checklist for the PRISMA scoping review guidelines. And in terms of the methods, I thought they did an appropriate search. They used, interestingly, not only papers, but they had a number of online databases where they went to and got a hold of some programs. And I thought they had an appropriate analysis. I maybe ask for just some brief comments if people disagreed on the methods, because I think we're going more in a direction of what we can add.
Did they justify their narrow scope? I don't remember seeing that. Why US?
No, they didn't.
And also, they could have gone wider and done nutrition. Like they could have done an update on nutrition education, but they chose.
But I think they wanted to. Yeah, I think they wanted to prove or show that this was something that was a quote better than sitting in a class and learning about carbohydrates. So what did they find?
Linda, can I just make one comment? One of the things I want to suggest is that while I appreciate that it might have met the PRISMA extension guidelines, the authors did a fantastic job finding these interventions, these different options. So I have nothing but praise for them for that part. I'm going to just suggest that their data analysis parts, that when they get to that part of the manuscript of the method section, they start to fall apart a little bit. They didn't follow the Arksy and O'Malley or the Levack approaches in enough detail for me to see how they did it. There's only 2 sentences where they talk about statistical analysis, descriptive analysis, and I'm like, no, things went a little sideways there. There are some great papers about it, freely available on JGME. We'll put them in the show notes. If you need some citations about how to do scoping reviews, can't say enough great things about those papers.
John?
Yeah, I think they were pretty exhaustive in their search. I would echo Jason's concern of focusing on culinary medicine maybe is a bit limited. I would be more interested to see what kind of nutrition educational interventions, because nutrition is a bigger field and maybe as equally relevant than food prep.
Yeah, I believe in the introduction, they talk about the fact that nutrition education has been a challenge, and that's why they wanted to look this as an innovation. And and again, John and Jason, you may be asking them to write another paper. We talked about that in the last podcast, right? It's you can be reviewer too if you want, but this is not what they wanted to do. So what did they find? They started out with 250 papers, knocked out a fair number of them as being irrelevant, and knocked out some of the others for perfectly valid inclusion and exclusion reasons. And what they found, I can summarize in one word: variability. So maybe that's what you get when you do a scoping review, when there's variability. They found that who was facilitating was variable. Yeah, there were physicians and nutritionists and learners. There was even a medical student who trained as a chef for one of them. So variable teachers, variable learners, both in terms of student level. First year, when they really hadn't seen a patient yet, to some towards the final year. Some of the learners were interprofessional. And importantly, variable formats or approaches, from a mandatory course to an elective to a several-hour class to a 2-semester course. But in general, they did find that the model was a brief didactic session with some theory in it, followed by a hands-on cooking session, and then a discussion, which they talked about as being a nutritional and cultural discussion while eating. I like that part, and John, I think you will too, which included the patient application strategies. And they talked about what you'd expect, common diseases influenced by lifestyle, some prevention. The program evaluations for these papers was not extensive, but they did say in general, and it's not a surprise, there was an improvement of student knowledge about healthy cooking strategies, meal planning, and culinary skills. Well, if you're learning how to chop carrots, that's probably the case. There was an increase in student confidence in discussing dietary interventions with patients. Well, that's good. And also, interestingly, student confidence in their own cooking abilities and application of nutrition knowledge to personal diet. So, Jason and Lara, I would recommend you go to one of these courses. Now, what about the podcast? The podcast talks a little bit about the paper, but it expands on the concept of culinary medicine. It describes these authors' programs and how it's applied to the patients, and it emphasized the benefits of acquiring what they call cultural competence in cooking. It also benefited community building and the interprofessional aspects. Before we get to the conclusions, a bit on two things. First of all, the results, and secondly, what is the podcast at? I'll go Jason, Lara, John.
I have nothing to say about the podcast. I didn't listen to it.
Anything about the results?
The only thing I would say about this is it made me think that maybe we could do a little review on wine tasting and medical education. That'd be another possibility that is perfectly aligned with diet and my interests.
Yeah, having seen your wine cellar, which is basically a bunch of bottles in a poor wine environment, it's like a learning environment. You need some work on that too, Jason.
Linda's being all snooty. We hide the good stuff when she comes over. That's the truth.
You don't have good stuff. And you don't know how to recognize it anyway.
I don't want to make any comments because I've been known to put ice cubes in my white wine because I just I don't like wine. I don't like any.
Are we going to be friends anymore? I don't even know what to say.
I just like it cold. I'm just saying. Okay, but I do have comments for you, Linda, on the results and on the podcast. So first about the results, is it surprising to us to hear that interventions, when we describe the techniques that were used, that we got highly variable? No. Right. Every intervention looks different in every context, but this is why we can't focus our intervention descriptions on techniques. We need to focus on the principles behind them. Why did you use these techniques? What are those principles? That's transferable. But that's a rant for another day. Because what I really wanted to get to on this, one of the things I want to just put a pin in and put in our little parking lot of things to come back in our next episode. Did you all notice that in the paper they talk about how Tulane has a program that's leading the pack? It's been adopted by many other institutions. So this is a point I just want to flag because in a future episode, we're going to talk about scholarship. And I want to flag this point in this episode because this is a program that was developed at one institution as being adopted at other institutions. So just hold on to that. The other thing, Linda, you did ask about the podcast, and I, being someone who respects you immensely, listened to the podcast as you suggested. And it's, it was really informative. There's really some nice discussion and other pieces and other insights from the authors that we were able to get through that podcast. So I think having those podcasts accompanying the articles, there's something to it when it's those dialogues. I appreciate it.
Who would have thunk that the English major would have used the word foreshadow in this episode?
Or thunk.
Or, yeah. So Linda, this is the Papers podcast, not the podcast. So I didn't listen to the podcast. And moreover, I must have totally missed it. Although I do see an icon at the top of the paper that's a podcast icon. So maybe it was maybe I missed the Easter egg there that told me to get to it. I would say the results this is just a big hot mess. It's not the author's fault, but the literature is a hot mess around this. The teachers are MD, RD. The sessions are aimed from 1 session to 2 semesters. The sides from 10 people in a cohort to more than 600. The program...
It's not a hot mess, John.
It's a hot mess.
That's not a hot mess. What it is, it just shows you that when you implement something out from one place to another, the techniques, the affordances of the context make it look different. But you can have the same principles underneath. It's just, the context pushes on innovation. That doesn't make it a hot mess.
Hot mess in my mind, because I don't know, based on the program evaluation, which is just an eye roll pre-post. Did you like it? Did you learn something? Which everybody's going to say yes. What shouldn't I do? What should I do? Like, this scoping review doesn't organize the literature or tell me where I should situate my own intervention to say, don't do this, or here's the gap there. I don't know if I want to implement culinary medicine, what's best practices. I don't know if I want to study the gaps in the literature or do further scholarship in this area, where to go. And that's not a fault of the authors.
I'll give you that.
That's where the literature shows. It's I'm going to stand by the hot mess.
So it's like stay away from sriracha in the lessons because
Yeah.
it interferes with the afternoon or something like that.
You wouldn't need to worry about your roughage, Jason.
Back to that, eh? Oh, man.
John, what about the podcast part of it?
He didn't listen.
Sorry, missed that.
I'm the only one who did their homework, Linda.
Okay,
I'm with you, friend.
Jish, sent it out twice.
It wasn't mandatory. It was an optional.
Okay, so me assessing you is not mandatory, it's optional. All right, so I'm going to give you feedback. Blah. Right, so what do the authors conclude? They thought that nutrition education remains inadequate and under-prioritized. They didn't actually say where they got that from. But they did say that the hands-on interprofessional approach of culinary medicine shows unique potential. But there are common themes in the teaching kitchen approach, and there is a need to define, as with many things, core competencies and standardized assessment strategies. So it really goes back to what John and Lara were saying, is that because it's all over the place, it would be nice if there were some core competencies. Couple of comments. The first two authors are med students. We're getting good at finding papers with med students. They're going to replace us in a few years as medical educators, so good on them. Are there benefits to adding a podcast to an academic article? I'd have to say in this case, yeah. There were things that came out in the discussion that couldn't come out in the paper, and it was quite enjoyable to listen to. So it may be something we want to think about. Any comments before we go on to the voting?
I just have one little tiny complaint about the methods. When I went to Google Scholar to learn something about this topic, culinary medicine, and I just typed in culinary medicine, there are a whole bunch of papers that came up in their time frame that they didn't pick up. They weren't listed as excluded or anything like that. So I'm just a bit curious about how that happened.
Interesting.
So it just speaks to credibility.
Yeah. Well, they may have picked them up, but they did eliminate 230 some as not relevant. So it may have been in that. Yeah. Okay, let's have a vote on the methods using our highly validated scale that makes Lara cringe. We'll go Jason, John, Lara.
I'm struggling with what to give this methodology. I used a scoping review, and it used a checklist, but it didn't do everything in RxC O'Malley. So what do we give that? I guess I'll give that a 3.
John?
I think they did all the right things. There wasn't a critical flaw. I'll give it 3 Michelin stars out of 5.
So I am a little concerned about the data analysis piece, so that's why I'm going to give it a 2. But I'll put a knife and fork emoji.
Oh, we like that. Well, I'm going to give it a 3. Nothing spectacular. I didn't pick up the analysis part of it. Okay, so I had hoped if the two gentlemen, and I use the term loosely, on this podcast had done their homework, we'd be able to have an education usefulness without the podcast and one with the podcast. So we'll try education usefulness without the podcast first, and then Lara and I will tell you the real stuff. So we'll go Lara, John, Jason, education usefulness.
So my problem is that I'm not sure in terms of impact and usefulness. The paper doesn't give us, I agree with John's concern. It's not providing us what we need to sort of move forward. And I found the discussion to be, they had a lot to say, but part of me was feeling maybe they wanted to write a perspective piece and just take that whole discussion, and that could be a whole paper in and of itself. It didn't really go back to the literature. So I'm going to give it a 2.
John?
I was surprised to see this as an academic medicine publication. I guess the editor-in-chief, Lara Roberts, thought that this was highly relevant to the readership. But for me, I don't know. If I was going to, I think this is a niche topic, culinary medicine. And so for me, this is a 2 Paul Bocuse out of 5. See, that's an Easter egg. You get that one, Linda, right? Paul Bocuse?
Of course I do.
Okay.
Is that the rat and Ratatouille?
Oh my God. You
No.
are dead to me.
That's an awesome reference.
Jason.
I'm really sorry to the authors. This is a niche area, and I just had trouble connecting with this topic, and I didn't think it was going to change my practice. So I'm really sorry. This is a 1 for me. With Canadian apologies like 12 times over, and a couple of other like sorry emojis. Is there a sorry emoji? But it just didn't reach me. I can't use this.
I suspect it didn't reach you because you're sort of a culinary Luddite who,
A craft dinner emoji.
I gave this a 3 because I looked a little bit more broadly than this as culinary medicine. I think that is important, and I think we've all agreed on that. But it also showed you to do a scoping review, find a lot of variability, which, as Lara pointed out, we would expect, and then try and come out with some ways of looking at how to move forward. And I, unlike you guys, thought that they had to come out with a way of moving forward, and they actually had developed a nice little structure for how the curricula should be structured. So I gave it a 3. So now, John and Jason, you can just keep quiet for a moment. Lara and I will discuss the education usefulness of this if you add in the podcast. Lara?
So, Linda, you're totally right. The podcast added another layer of insight and appreciation for me because of the discussion the authors provided. And it's so much so, in fact, that I went back to the paper after I listened to the podcast and think, wait a minute, I must have missed something. There was, because when I first read the paper, it was, I had some concerns, so it was whatever. But after listening to the podcast, I'm like, wait a minute, there's more to it. There's more to it. I got to go back to the paper. With the podcast, I would move my score up to a 3, for sure.
Yeah, okay. So I would move my up to a 4, maybe in part because they described how one of the attendings couldn't chop
I love
carrots,
that.
Couldn't chop carrots, and so it sort of leveled out the hierarchy. But that's just an aside.
Did they do the episode while cooking? Because that would be awesome.
Yeah.
They could do some chopping noises, a little bit of frying.
Yeah,
Or in John's case,
sizzling
microwave
of this
noises.
and that. Oh, no, it wouldn't be frying if it was for good nutrition. Anyway, I think one of the points is also thinking about podcasts or the combination of papers and podcasts as a different kind of education scholarship. And I am going to presage one of our future episodes when we might well be talking about this. So that's it. It's a wrap. We're ready to serve it up to you. Oh, you didn't like that? Okay. So
I thought it was good.
all right. So
Are you cleaning up the hot mess at this moment? So it's gonna-
I'm wiping it up. All right. So thanks for listening, everybody. And if you want to know a little bit more, or you want to contact us, please check out the website or email us. In the meantime, let's say until next time, John,
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Lara,
Talk to you later.
Jason,
Take care, everybody. Eat well, high fiber.
and from me, bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and take care.
Presumably the editor-in-chief, Laura Roberts, thought that this was...
I like the editor-in-cheese. That's appropriate to the dietetics.
Let me just say,
what a
let's do
giveaway.
it one more time.
Was it brie? Was it blue cheese?
Hey.